Good morning and welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. Last time I covered a lot of ethnographic, or at least alleged ethnographic information concerning the Inuit, or the better known by us as the Eskimo, but they are in the literature many times referred to as the Inuit, and I just misspelled it. And Inuit, and they are the Eskimo, and I gave you lots of characteristics about them. I think I began first by giving you the ethnocentric version of their culture, and that should be enough to trigger any questions that you might have, versus then what I covered second in the major portion of the lecture was the culturally relative account of the Eskimo culture. Again, listing them by traits, giving you, which would be a hand-down, if you will, from historical particularism, listing traits, etc. Except, of course, in the case of the Eskimo, you really can't talk much about, at least in this period of anthropology, you couldn't talk very much about contact with other peoples and what they might have exchanged or didn't exchange. Because if anybody approximated an isolated cultural grouping in the New World, it would have been the Eskimo, although no group, as I say, has ever been found to be totally in isolation. So, I covered lots of different characteristics. Is there any questions that anyone either in the class here in the library have, or our home viewer, or excuse me, our site student, or of course we can't ask any from the home viewers, but they might wish now that they could be here. Any questions? It's all very clear. You got everything down you need to get down. No fill in the blanks or anything like that. Well, that's great. I must be doing a good job. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit and emphasize, because I think it's one of the things that stands out for me as an adaptive aspect of Eskimo culture, and some of that information I've already given you. I'm just going to re-emphasize it now by way of bringing that to your attention, and that would be variation in the family structure. Ideally, Eskimos are said to have a nuclear form of family organization, not that dissimilar from our own. Nuclear, just as in a nuclear explosion, right? But the nuclear family unit is a mythical family unit, supposedly characteristic and typical of the United States, consisting of parents and children. That's supposedly our family unit. When it comes to reality, of course, it's a different picture, but that's what sociologists and anthropologists both tell us all the time when they're talking in very general terms and not being that specific, although both anthropologists and especially sociologists, I think, are quick to add in current times that the real family structure in American society is not only also very varied, but also does not conform much to this nuclear family unit. But nonetheless, it's often cited in older literature as the typical family unit for Americans and also for the Eskimo. So again, the ideal family unit, if you will, in Eskimo culture is to have one male who's the hunter, one female who is the wife and mother and chewer, if you remember, of hide, and then third and fourth would be one male child, and if they had that luxury, then also a subsequent female child. But in reality, what I talked about was that there were many different kinds of families among the Eskimos if one were to do an ethnography on the site. And see if I can find them here in my notes. Although it's not necessary. I can just do it. Typical family unit then consists of one adult male, one adult female, and children. And generally it's a two-generation family. And we'll have occasion to talk about an exception to that in just a moment. And occasionally a grandparent will live with the family, but that condition can best be described as transitional. And then I talked to you last time about those situations in which sometimes a female hunter emerges. And when that occurs, male gender is also ascribed to that female hunter. And so then she or he, whichever, is then expected to take a wife, and many times that wife already has children. Again, the Eskimo are not a society that have highly developed concepts of property or owning estates or houses or territory or people. You know, that's something that really is more associated in current times with the West or in advanced industrial or electronicized societies. So that certainly is a variation in family structure, and I think you can see that it's really a variation that sometimes has to be allowed, and it's seen, I think, in the rawness of that environment in which they live and the kinds of demands that it makes upon these people socially, if you buy that as an explanatory reason for why people have certain behaviors or not. It's kind of on the culturally materialistic side, but I make no apologies about my biases. Female infanticide contributes to the formation of a family unit that consists of 2 adult females and their children. It's kind of an extension of that argument about the female hunter. And then family units can also consist of 2 adult males, an adult female, and their children, which I told you was an example of polygyny. And there are, in addition, even examples of family units that are polyandrous. For those of you who haven't had, although I think everybody in here has had introductory cultural anthropology, but in case you haven't, or for one of our home viewers who's not a student, polyandrous. It's a word that refers to polyandry, which means that the union is 1 adult male, 2 adult females, and their children. In other words, multiple marriages. Well, that's quite a variation, especially in a simple, quote, simple hunting and gathering technology. I sometimes cringe when I say that, because when I really think of what the complexity of the technology as used, in other words, what the Eskimos are able to do with the limited resources that they have, it's really difficult in any real sense to call it simple. But simple here is a contextual kind of adjective that refers to the fact that, compared, however, to agricultural societies or industrial societies or electronicized societies or whatever, it is simple by comparison. But obviously the complexity of their culture is not that dissimilar to our own. It's just the complexity is in different areas. All right, what I want to do, one of the things I've tried to give you, and if you'll look at an earlier lecture, either on tape or just recall it from your notes, this account of Eskimo culture is not real. This is a product of bias that comes from anthropology itself. It's a narrative, I think, about Eskimo culture that's been somewhat put forward, and anthropologists buy into it. And that comes from that notion that I talked to you about before, and that's where I was explaining all these things, of the ethnographic present. It's difficult. I can't even take this account of the Eskimo, for example, and tell you, well, this is the real account, and there's a wrong account over here. It's not that simple. Part of this account is real, part of it is unreal, part of this account is true and accurate, and part of this account is inaccurate. But my purpose in giving this lecture was not to give you an accurate account of Eskimo culture, but rather to give you how an example or an illustration, a situation that anthropologists as a cultural group conform to, and they buy into this example at this time. And I like to use it because more than any other, it illustrates for us this ethnographic present notion. It also illustrates for us the kind of science that anthropologists thought they were doing under the aegis or the leadership of Franz Boas. It's kind of like, where they came to emphasize empirical. They wanted to distinguish themselves from those 19th century cultural evolutionists. And in doing that, they came up with this kind of presentation. It seems to me like it's kind of, when you cut the time out of it, when you take time out of it, it makes it unreal. It makes it difficult. And the whole orientation, the whole presentation, better said, is oriented towards your seeing the ways in which this culture is adaptive to the particular environment of that group lives in. This is not to say that it could be reduced to a statement of environmental determinism, because it cannot. There are other factors that they bring in, as you already know, again, if you review your lecture notes or review the tapes, that would let you know that or would inform you in that way. But it is okay as an account of Eskimo culture to associate with Boasians, or Boaz in the American school. In that sense, and that's the way in which I offer it to you. The difficulty in offering this to you is that it contributes very seriously to a distortion of Eskimos and stereotyping of Eskimo culture and of Eskimo or individuals. The same way that I think anthropologists of this era stereotyped lots of people. It stands out when anthropologists, and we'll talk about this maybe a little later, when anthropologists attempt a study of a much more complex people, this approach really shows its deficiencies. It doesn't show it so strongly here. But when you get, for example, to a book or a monograph by Ruth Benedict called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which was a study of Japanese national culture or character as seen in this culturally relative model. In that book, she's very, and it's also monolithic, it's also stereotypical. All Japanese seemingly are the same. And I think you realize even back in the 40s when she wrote that book, Japanese culture was much more complex than that. And there are other reasons that the book is bad, and possibly on a later occasion I'll have time to talk about that. But here we are. I'm giving you an account of Eskimo culture, and we'll continue it for a little bit because there still remains some characteristics that I haven't covered that were given you in the ethnocentric account, and now I want to give it to you in the culturally relative account. And in so doing, there's some explanation involved. You take these individual traits and you are able to, the word I use, or I like to use now, is contextualize them. You're able to set them in a context or place them in a context. And that's the way you explain them. You know, you don't see female infanticide as an institution that they have over here where, you know, Eskimos are just hell-bent on killing baby girls. That's really not what it's about. If somebody asks you about female infanticide among Eskimos, now you can talk to them a little more knowledgeably about that, and you can start arguing for it in the context of the larger Eskimo society and culture. You can talk about that their environment is so harsh and so atypical to some extent for human beings or human habitation that it requires dramatic and drastic forms of culture or cultural institutional arrangements in order for them to survive. And one of those, at least in the Eskimo case, would be female infanticide. And it's then interrelated with or interdependent with, say, their religious beliefs and some of those values of, that are associated with a belief in reincarnation. Or in the family unit, this notion that, which is the main, in fact, maybe the only social unit. It's hard for us to appreciate that, I think. It's hard for me to appreciate it, so there I extend my limitation to you. I may be doing that unfairly. But it's hard for me to appreciate that a society in which the level of complexity extends only to the nuclear family. These people very seldom see each other. And there's these environmental impositions are such that you know, you spend most of your year, so as it were, hunting. And in hunting, you are with your wife and your children, if you're me, and I were there, and I were an Eskimo. And that would take up most of what my life would be about, because my total purpose is to perpetuate my society and culture. Now, Eskimos don't see it that way. They don't live to perpetuate Eskimo culture, but they do live, I would see it as an extreme value to see that my son had all that he needed in order to survive, especially if I were to suddenly be taken away. And many Eskimos died, violent deaths. You live in an extreme environment like that, you're not going to go to Sunnyside Acres and live out your latter days. You're going to have some kind of violent accident, or an animal will get the better of you, or whatever. It's the kind of social organization that it is. It's extremely simple in its structure, but complex in its cultural content. Or at least that's the way these anthropologists want to present it to you. And I think that part of it seems to me to be fair and accurate, that it would be simple in structure but complex in cultural content or substance. Another, I think, fascinating characteristic of Eskimo culture that we haven't even touched on, either in the ethnocentric version or this one, is the song duels that they have. Song duels, it illustrates or emphasizes this notion of this simple structure. And that is, what it brings me to mind the most is rapping. Only this would be a very earlier form of rapping, if there's such a thing as, I don't think in any way Eskimo song duels contributed to the formation of rap music, but it's a similar kind of function that's being performed, in the sense that, if, say, you and I are Eskimos and we're both male and we have problems with one another, you came into my area that I traditionally have been hunting and you killed 3 seal that would have been the food on my family's plate. So, metaphorically speaking, since I doubt that Eskimos had plates. Then, what do you do? How do you resolve that dispute? There's no court to go to. There's no border bureau that Governor Bush has appointed in Austin that's going to take care of this, so you can't complain to the state level government. You can't go to your county commissioners. There is no such thing. And you can't go to the city council persons in downtown Houston, because there is no such comparable level of institutional complexity among Eskimos. All they have is nuclear families that interact with one another on rare occasions. So what do? When there is a dispute, they resort to a song duel. And what they're doing in these song duels is the individuals are matched one against the other. They are expected to kind of sing in a sing-songy kind of way. If we were doing it, my mother is better than your mother, and your mother has pockmarks all over her face. That's my contribution for singing for the morning. But it would be that's why they call it a song duel. There is that kind of sing-songy rhythm that goes with it. I've heard on tape anyway, or record, to date myself again. Recordings of this by very adventuresome ethnographers, and even reporters, by the way. This week is marked, well, I'm not supposed to chronologize anything for these lectures, but I think it's important, it's interesting, and so I will. In the time period in which I'm giving this lecture, Hugh Downs is retiring as a reporter for ABC. Way back when I was a beginning professor, whenever that was, in 67, 68, something like that, Hugh Downs was a reporter for NBC News. And he was doing a documentary kind of report on the Eskimo in the far north. I can't remember. Well, it's probably a special or something. I can't imagine it's being on the evening news. But I can see where it would be of interest. It was about the family, and he was showing how hazardous it was. And he was also showing that while Eskimo are highly touted and revered about their family situation in terms of their love of children, that actually one of the things about Eskimos is it's very uncommon for them to readily adopt a child that does not belong to them already in terms of kinship. In other words, they don't take on burdens that they don't want. And that's the one thing that I learned in Hugh Downs' report that I hadn't known before. But it was interesting to see this reporter up there in the snow, and the blizzard was blowing his face, and he had hair then, real hair, and it was flopping in the breeze, and you could tell he was really uncomfortable, but he was doing it. So I'll just give him some credit for that now. But anyway, the accounts of this culture are not that frequent, and they're infrequent. And and because the environment was difficult, and people don't just willingly choose to go up there. I happen to have a friend who's an archaeologist, Doug Brown from Brown University, Doug Anderson, excuse me, from Brown University, who is an archaeologist in the Eskimo area. But that's unusual. That's atypical. That's not characteristic for archaeologists to do, except that he does have several students who've graduated, etc., with their PhDs who now would love to be known as an authority on archaeology in Eskimo land. But anyway, all these different things, these song duels, this was a way of whoever could last the longest, who could ever stay more creative, who could ever say more negative things about the other person, causing the other person to kind of lose emotional balance, I guess, and give up. And that's the way you would resolve the dispute. So if you had a dispute over land, or not land, ownership again, but use, or if you had a dispute, maybe if somebody took access to your wife when you didn't offer it, there could be all kinds of disputes that might occur. And again, the nature of those disputes would reflect in detail, I think, or give you some depth to explicate some of these other values in Eskimo society. They would again refurbish or refresh or reemphasize these values as I've already given them to you. It would show you that these people value these kinds of things, and these kinds of conflicts reflect that in terms again of their cultural content. So song duels become an excellent way to kind of engage students, if we were to recreate them, in seeing what daily life among Eskimo could be like when they were in contact with other people. Now I want to not shift gears, but kind of, again, make Eskimo culture a little more alive by recreating for you one of my favorite chapters in Hans Reusch's novel, Top of the World, which I think also bears on this notion of variation in family organization and how it might actually unfold some of these different and rare instances of cultural values that are very contrastive or different from ours. And we sometimes have problems of appreciating how they could possibly engage or indulge themselves in these kinds of behaviors, because on the one hand they may seem cruel to us, on another hand they may seem totally unfitting for human beings. We would, quote, never do that. All right, this is chapter 4 in Hans Reusch's novel, Top of the World. And the reason I like to use the novel and an account from the novel is that it really does, as I say, it brings this kind of staid listing of characteristics to life a little bit. It gives it a greater depth. So in this chapter that we're talking about, we have these two characters whom I've mentioned before. The male is called Ernenek, and if I'm going to say these names, maybe I should write them out for you. And they have a kind of typical family organization that one might expect for an Inuit family or Eskimo family. His name is Ernenek. And his wife name, his good wife, is called Asiak. So that's how you spell those. This is a story about Ernenek and Asiak and the birth of a child and what happens. It's their first child. And when the book opens up, the novel opens up, in this family unit there are two sisters, a mother, and another male whose name I've forgotten. And Ernenek comes along in that first chapter, establishes a relationship with one of the sisters, Asiak, and then they take off as a separate family unit. Again, because one of the goals of this kind of organization is to kind of constantly be mindful of reducing the number of people that this family unit has to support, in terms of the hunter's activities or the wife's chewing or whatever. And I myself see the wife's chewing equally as important. It's certainly not as glamorous as hunting, but if I were the hunter and I didn't have pliable pants to put on, I certainly wouldn't step myself outside the igloo. Okay, so you got Ernenek and Asiak living by themselves now. They're an individual family unit. Actually, the mother stays with them. which is unusual. So you got a family unit consisting of husband and wife and the mother's mother. There is no patrilineal or matrilineal emphasis here. That's why we call it a nuclear family kind of organization, or among scholars who study American families, they call them bilateral kindred groups or something like that. But we won't go there today. It's too complicated. But in this unit, after a while, the normal thing happens, or typical or expected thing happens. Asiak becomes pregnant with a child. She's pregnant. She's going to have a baby. And Eskimos don't necessarily associate sex with children. Meaning, in other words, they don't have intercourse in order to have children or more children or whatever. Intercourse is something they enjoy, that they laugh about. In fact, often the word for sexual intercourse is translated into English not as sexual intercourse, but as laughing. And I think that's I would like to think all my sexual adventures were something that would cause me to laugh. And I don't mean in a derisive, either making fun of myself or my partner, but rather, it was something that I enjoyed and my partner enjoyed, and we were really fully engaged in it and got from it emotional support and fun. I think the Eskimos really seemed, in the accounts that I've read, they seem to picture sexual behavior as fun behavior. I mean, we have that as a goal, but seldom do we ever get there because our notions of property get in the way, our notions of jealousy, that it's just something that we grow up with. Emotional ownership of other people is something that's characteristic of this culture and Western society in general, I might add, and something that would be totally atypical or untypical, if that's the word, for Eskimo culture or Eskimo people. So in this context, Asiak is about to have a child, and her mother's there, and her mother's helping her, as mothers would do. I mean, after all, the mother's been through it before. She's had, we know, at least 2 daughters. So we know she's had experience. And there must have been a son in there, because neither daughter was reared as a hunter or as a male, so that meant a son preceded those 2 daughters, and he's probably already off somewhere before the novel began having his own family. But since there's really no family connection that's that broad or that extensive, or the family unit beyond the nuclear arrangement is unimportant, you're never going to hear about the brother once he's gone. The same way we never hear again of the sister once she left, or once we departed from her. Ernanek and Asiak and me. I guess I'm now the mother. Whatever. I change roles constantly. I'm a leprechaun that way, or a chameleon. So here they are, and you got to remember that the average lifespan again is 40 years, right? 40 years old. So if you only get to be 40 years, and then you somehow kick off because either your teeth come out or you you have an accident while hunting or whatever, you just can't continue to function as an adult Eskimo, then your time is up, as I'll get to once this story's over. So the child is born. The grand day comes. Everyone's fondest expectations or greatest dreams or goals, culturally speaking, have been realized, because the child that's born is a male. First attempt, first child, boom, or voila, they got what they wanted. And so the mother and the wife, Asiak, are very excited. They immediately want to run to Ernanek and tell him, and that not only has the child been born and lived, and everything seems to be okay. A minor caution in that, because I'm going to tell you what's not okay in a second. And so they should be running to Ernanek and tell him, because now things can proceed the way they're supposed to. They can immediately get to the task of rearing this child, giving it the care and devotion that it needs, and the nurturing that it needs, in order for this child, this male child, to become a successful adult male hunter. and down the road having his own wife and his children, etc. Remember, survival is the supreme value here. But there's something wrong that Asiac notices. And it's not something that you would, I think you would have probably looked at this infant and said, what a beautiful Eskimo baby, like you always say. There's a joke about that in anthropology land, but babies always have to be pretty whether they are or not. When you see someone with a baby, like in Seinfeld, you always tell them what a pretty child they have, and you go on the side. That's true everywhere. Everyone always comments on babies, and everyone always tells the mother that babies are beautiful, and certainly Asiac's mother was just beside herself, in the pride that she had in her own grandson. But Asiac wasn't so happy because it's very important to them that she saw that it had 2 feet and 10 toes, and it had 2 hands and 10 fingers. It had a nose with 2 nostrils, had 2 eyes, had lips, had ears, both of them. Everything was there that was supposed to be there, genitalia, etc. But it was missing something. What was it missing? Don't answer. I'm just supposed to keep you spellbound for a second. It was missing teeth. Well, again, if you remember or you recall that the lifespan of most people does not go beyond 40, excuse me, most individuals would not have an experience of watching children grow up. So they wouldn't see babies. Unless, Asiac's own family history had been one where she did see her sister grow up or her son grow up. But whatever, in this particular family arrangement, she was unaware of it. She was unaware of the fact that teeth are not fully formed at birth. In fact, she had no notion of development that way, or biological development, and that being a primate and being a mammal, as humans are, or as anthropologists tell us anyway, that development occurs in postpartum, a lot of development, so that yes, babies are developed to a certain point at birth, but then after birth has occurred, and don't put the after and the birth together, after birth has occurred, more development takes place, and we know that. We know that it's in the first, after a year, I think a child has teeth, or it's beginning to have some teeth, and we wait for that first tooth to come in. It's a big event in our culture, especially if you're a parent. Second and third child, it becomes less eventful. If it's the 5th and 6th, it becomes more hateful. But whatever, those reflect our values, not Eskimo. And anyway, so Asiac is distraught. She simply does not know what to do, because here she has this otherwise beautiful little baby boy. And she's thinking, I have to allow him to die. And the Eskimo really don't kill a baby if it's deformed, as she would think in this case, or if it had been a female. See, they do also put to death sometimes, or allow to die is a better way of saying it, and ethnographically more accurate. They would either expose it to the environment, in other words, remove any clothing it has, stick it outside, and it would only take a few minutes for it to be totally gone in terms of living. And that's what would happen, and that's what she feared would now ensue or take place, right? They're going to have to expose it to the elements, it's going to be put to death, and then she'll have to wait until she has a male child in the future. It's a big event. It's a terrible tragedy. She's, again, terribly distraught. So the mother speaks up. A very wise mother, it turns out, or at least a pragmatic, self-serving mother, as mothers can be. I don't mean anything by that. And so she says to Asiac, she says, I know what the secret rituals are to cause these teeth to come in, or for this baby, your infant, to develop some teeth, to grow some teeth. And if you'll just let me stay around long enough, another year, another season, full range of, change of seasons, which I think in this area would be 2. We call them night and day. Then I'll gladly get on my ice floe and go away, and my life will be over. Well, Asiac was so desperate. Of course. What do you need? Can I get you money, a car, insurance, an extra house? Remember, we're in Eskimo land here. Nothing like that. But she was ecstatic in her response to her mother's offer, and she even felt, the mother was so convincing of her knowledge of these religious rituals that she felt free to confide in Aaron to tell him that, yes, the good news is you have a male child. The bad news is he doesn't have any teeth, and we don't know, but we got something to do about it. The problem is solvable, I guess is the word. So indeed, that's what happens. I mean, you can predict that the rest of the chapter becomes a little boring. We've already peaked. The mother goes through certain kinds of incantations, spreading of seal's blubber on the head, whatever. I don't really remember, but I just know she played the game rather well. And Asiac, quote, ate it up, and so did Ernanek. And sure enough, within a prescribed amount of time, short of that extra year, the child starting having individual teeth appear. And they knew then that everything was going to be all right. And so then, and this is kind of to document for you what that geronticide is about that I've mentioned before, I think on the ethnocentric account. And geronticide is, again, another characteristic of Eskimo culture that is often talked about very quickly because it seems so contrary or contrastive to our own, is the killing of older people, people 40 and above, which means I wouldn't be a vague memory in anybody's life now. I'll be gone so long that nobody alive would recall who I was. I would be one of their illustrious and noble ancestors, but that's not hardly the individualized kind of eternity that most of us are looking forward to spend or share or experience. So she realizes that her year is up, and she's very happy because it's hard being an Eskimo when you're 40 and above, when you're old, and you don't have teeth anymore, and you're a female. Your whole claim to being a productive member of Eskimo society has already gone. And you've now extended it somewhat artificially and self-servingly by using this ruse of, telling your daughter that you know the secret rituals to give your grandson teeth and all. Well, she's not going to try to extend anymore. That really was genuine on her part. She did see that her daughter was deeply upset, and she did in many ways, she wanted to reassure her daughter. And, I don't think it would have worked as well, if you think about it, if she had said something like, I know the secret magic rituals to give your child teeth, but you'll have to wait 6 months. Meanwhile, I've got to go now. It just wouldn't work that way. So she did stay the extra year. She was able to enjoy her grandson, which is an unusual luxury that this Eskimo family afforded her in terms of this context now, this situation. And it came time for Asiac's mother to really put herself in a situation where she's going to die. And the way in which they typically did that, or at least again it's reported in the literature, is that she would set herself on an ice floe, a piece of ice that's out there, and kind of go off. And this was done with no fanfare. One night, your husband or your wife, whichever you are, would go to sleep and with your children in the igloo, and your mother would be there, and the next morning she would be gone. No announcement, no preparation, and no mention the next morning that she was no longer there. Out of sight, not really out of mind, but at least very quickly out of mind, because no references, no discussion about her. But let's go back then, because this, I think, 5th chapter, this death of the old woman, or the 40-year-old woman, I should say, is being told to you from the viewpoint, or is the narrative as if you were this woman. And it shows, or you experience, or you get the words then that indicate that she sees the ice floe in which she's going to go. She puts herself on it. She starts removing items of clothing from her body in preparation for hastening the thing. I mean, they didn't want to, they knew they had to die. They knew they had seen plenty of people die. They knew somewhat what that was about. And they certainly didn't want to, endure it or stretch it out, as is sometimes our cultural value to do. They knew pain was not something they chose to experience, and if they had it, let's get through it the quickest way possible. Because after all, they also had a belief in reincarnation. She didn't think she was leaving forever. She thought she might come back as something or someone else. And so she puts herself on a piece of ice and ice floe, and she goes off. And you feel with her as the narrative unfolds. The growing cold first, the extreme cold. If any of you have ever been in the Midwest, you know what I'm talking about. January and February are not ideal months in Illinois, as I remember, and it probably is not that dissimilar, at least in terms of the feeling. Physical, biological feeling that one has to endure when one is in a car driving in Illinois in the middle of January. It would be comparable, I think, to the kind of experience that one has as a female Eskimo when one is freezing to death. And at first it's very painful, and then she starts having a sensation of getting warm. In other words, her body's getting numb, but it's perceived as getting warm. And pain starts to subside, and then she just kind of, quote, goes to sleep. And in a way, that's accurate, except that as she's about to pass out or whatever, go into that last stage where she's unconscious prior to death, actual death, she sees in the distance, a large white polar bear, or white, one of those giant bears in the north that are white that I see so often. I think, that drink Coca-Cola commercials, Kodiak bears, whatever they're called. And and that just makes a final smile come on her face, because she knows that she's going to be, gone in a moment, so she's not going to experience anything that's about to unfold. But she's relatively sure the bear has seen her. The bear is going to not kill, because she's already dead, but freshly dead. The bear is going to eat her. And she's overjoyed that she's going to become maybe the next meal for her grandson. Because Aaron will be out the next morning hunting. One of the first creatures he'll come across or into contact with will be this bear, and he will kill the bear, and then it will provide great feasting for Aaron and his family. In this case, now reduced by 1 to parents and 1 child. So that's kind of a cultural-centric or Eskimo-centric view of what happens. And I think Hans Reusch really does try in his narrative and his text to really experience what it must have been like to have been an Eskimo and to have gone through these various kinds of social behaviors and what it would make you feel like emotionally, etc. It's kind of like, archaeologists are always trying to reconstruct social structure as exhibited or reflected in the remains that have been left behind. I think sometimes anthropologists have tried to do the same thing, and maybe even to a certain extent use the same model, because they try to reconstruct, as Hans Reusch did, what it must have felt like to have been an Eskimo. See, even if I ask you, say you've experienced something very contrary to my cultural experience. Say I ask you, what's it like to be female in this society, and you tell me certain things. I say, oh, yes, I understand. My heart goes out to you or whatever. Hi, that's BS. I have no idea what it's like because I haven't experienced it. All I can do at best is, as psychologists sometimes tell us, is empathize. I can kind of think up in my mind what it may be like. So, that's what Hans Reusch is doing. He's empathizing. He's thinking, what it might be like, and he, in a really, I think, excellent effort, tries to tell us that. But it shows the limitation, I think, of the ethnographic approach and of the culturally relative approach. You can only go so far. And at best, it represents, once an anthropologist has done it, or an author, a reconstruction, a fabrication. It's not real Eskimo culture. It's not what Eskimos experience, etc. It's just the limitation, I think, that's brought on by who we are as humans, about the nature of our contact and our being able to communicate with one another, and the limitations that are kind of a necessary part of that, not just among the Eskimo, but among ourselves and all other peoples of the world. And we've taken more note of that in subsequent generations of anthropologists, those generations to a large extent that some of you will be talking about in your group presentations. But anyway, this, I think, should elaborate for you more fully what it would be like in the give and take of everyday life of being an Eskimo. And again, it's in the version that Hans Reusch affords us. But it makes me feel as if I know a little bit more about Eskimos once I read those chapters, and I would think that you now know what it might be more like to have these kinds of values, these kind of happenings, these very kinds of expectations about what will happen in certain situations, and then they do, and how the various actors, or natives in this case, respond to those situations, and how they play. I mean, one of the things that always happens in cultures is that everybody plays with the rules. They always are manipulating the rules. I think that's another part of being human that kind of seemingly transcends cultural identity in one group or area to another. We all do that. Whether we're Eskimo, whether we're whatever we are, we have that ability, and we do that. And that's where new rules come from. If culture change is occurring, part of that culture change arises out of the manipulation that occurs on the part of individuals in terms of how can I get around that rule, or how can I do something that I'd rather be doing instead of what my culture tells me I should be doing, which is an important distinction that we'll get to probably shortly, but shortly for me may mean the next lecture, between that notion of ideal culture versus real culture as a member of a society and culture. So, I think I've told you about most of the patterns of culture that I have told you were characteristic, or I'm wanting to give you as characteristic for Eskimo society. The only thing I want to elaborate on a little more is to just take you through geronticide a little bit, and to make you see that it represents a kind of natural byproduct of the factors in the environment, of traditional culture among the Eskimo, and really there are no alternatives that I can detect that would be given them. They don't have a Sunnyside Acres, as I said before. There's no retirement community or post-active. Every time I turn the news on, I hear these things about I should have so much money in my retirement account. If I don't have a 401k, I'm supposed to become slightly delirious and foam at the mouth or something, because you're supposed to have at least $1 million in this society in order to retire comfortably. Well, I'm here to tell you I'm never going to have it unless I don't retire until I'm about 90. But anyway, all that aside, in my poverty-stricken conditions as a retired anthropologist, the Eskimo would have none of these values, goals, ideas, or notions. And they certainly would have no notion of a nursing home. Most of us, that's one of our greatest fears if we look to the far. Most of you haven't even thought of it yet, but you will sooner or later, and you'll think of it in terms of, when you visit a beloved aunt or somebody like that in a nursing home, some of your thought is going to be, am I going to end up in a nursing home? Am I going to be, that way? I remember, I had a beloved aunt, one of my favorite aunt, actually. I used to visit all the time when I would go home, and we would go to the nursing home and see her. She survived there 8 years, and I don't want to dwell on her or what happened to her, but it was not very pleasant, and it wasn't because the nursing home was bad. It just, her health was so poor, and her living condition was so dehumanized. She had no mobility. She had an operation for arthritis of the knees, and it wasn't successful, so she was suddenly without knee joints, and you don't put them back in once you've taken them out, but you do remove the artificial ones. So she was totally then had become at a very late age in life, in her 80s, and then she survived into her 90s as a cripple, bedfast. And then shortly after she was in the nursing home, she had a stroke, couldn't talk but could think. So you sometimes could look at her face and she was trying to tell you something. She knew all the stuff that came out of her mouth was nonsense syllables. but you knew that she was trying to tell you she loved you and she was so glad to see you. Well, this doesn't happen. This kind of tragic picture of what happens to us at the end of our lives, in quote, the golden years, doesn't happen for Eskimo. And sometimes I think this might be preferable. I'd rather hop on an ice floe anytime, as opposed to changing places or trading places with my aunt prior to her death, which, as I say, took 8 years to happen. And I assume, and that seems to be what the goal of everyone in a nursing home becomes, and I may be unfair, and if there are any nursing home folks watching this tape, if I am, you can contact me at my email address and bring me up short. But it was not a comfortable experience, and again, when I see how it was for Eskimos, I no longer look on geronticide as a terrible thing. In other words, this woman could retain her dignity to the end of her life. She still had choice. She was the one who got to say when it occurred, and she's the one who got to see that it did occur. No one else came along and said, "My, your teeth are getting short. I think it's about time you kind of considered going on a vacation on an ice floe." No one was sarcastic to her. Sarcasm was not a value in Eskimo society and culture as it is in this one. I'm really not sure, and just because I haven't thought about it, what value sarcasm fulfills, but I'm sure it must be something because it's so prevalent in this culture and society. But it would not be a treasured value among the Eskimo. So again, you see, I'm seducing you in my logic now. I am the enemy that your mother and your preacher warned you about. I am, at this point, being very much a moral and cultural relativist. This is what Baptists shriek in horror about. They're really talking about us cultural relativists, us anthropologists, us who hold up other value systems as equal to our own, or at least comparable to our own, be it religion, be it family organization, be it, in this case, values and attitudes surrounding older age, etc. And that's the purpose in my giving you this lecture, is to show you what cultural relativism really is, and it comes to a concrete expression as these cultural relativists envisioned it. All right, a couple items I haven't talked about, and they're the more everyday things that I just use to kind of shake you up when I first give you that ethnocentric account. And one of them, if you'll remember, was that they washed their hair in urine. When women, we say women because we never think of a man as presenting himself, except in modern times. We know the context in which that would occur. But even in our culture, until recently, that at least wasn't so public a presentation. But in Eskimo land, it was also very chauvinistic, very sexist, very decidedly so, very proudly so, very culturally relatively so. And it was women who prepared themselves to receive men. Aaron and Ek didn't have to remove the smell of blubber from his skin that he would sometimes rub on his skin, and it would get rancid because, that's what blubber does, or flesh does, or byproducts of humans do once you leave it out for a while and you don't, quote, wash it off. I mean, he didn't have any Lux or whatever another brand of soap might be to remove that so that he would appear fresh, if nothing else, and neutral in his body odor. No, it would be pretty rancid. I can imagine putting on those same leggings every day that his wife has chewed, and you put that on top of blubber that he's rubbed on himself and it's gotten rancid, and whatever. Just imagine, if you think body odor is a wonderful event in your life, think what it must have been in an Eskimo's life, except they didn't necessarily see it as something to be revolted by or to respond to or react to, because from the time, again, this was what the cultural relativists would have you believe, and in this context, from times they were little bitty baby Eskimos, they were told this is the way things were, and they experienced their parents in this way, and seemed all right to them. But it did get a little thorny, or whatever the word would be, about hair. Imagine hair never being washed. Your own. I know my hair, even though it's real short and little, not much of it, if I don't wash it every day, I feel it's dirty And in fact, it looks a little, it starts hanging. It starts pressing down on my head. Well, again, I don't really feel the weight because it's not that bountiful. But nonetheless, I think most of us, I don't know if you wash your hair every day or not, but if you're accustomed to washing your hair every day, you notice if you haven't. And boy, if 2 days has passed, it's unbearable. I can't stop, all over. I'm just itching everywhere. But that's not true among Eskimos. They can go days and days and days and days and days and days, and this is not unusual for, quote, hunters and gatherers, I sometimes wonder if there might not be Friday night contests where people outsmell one another. I'm being awful here, very somewhat trivial. I'm just trying to get across to you that when, by contrast, that when the wife was about to engage in sex with someone probably that she didn't know yet, someone her husband had selected for her, in those contexts that I had mentioned before, I'll tell you about the incident in the novel, and you'll see how it's a moral relativist and why Baptists might respond to it. And I don't mean to pick on Baptists. It's just because I know Baptists better than other folks, because my own parents were and are Baptists. Anyway, she would wash her hair with urine. Well, again, we respond ethnocentrically. Ew, how could she? The odor must be terrible. I'm here to tell you, it's better than the preceding odor. When she gets that lathered up, so to speak, and that dirt and grease come out, and her hair now has a luster and beauty that we thought only Prel could give us, you might try this. It does clean your hair. It does cut grease. Urine does. So it will clean. It may leave other residues that you don't like, but that's a culture-bound kind of experience that all of us have. We really, in this culture, think any natural human product is something to be gotten rid of. And that's why you have so many products in Walgreens, etc. Now I will look into the TV camera and say that, because I sometimes think that's funny, the extent to which, now we got, I can't remember the product, besides it's a digression. But, there's no Avon lady at the North Pole going ding-dong, giving you the most recent list of products that they have to remove unseemly natural byproducts in your scalp. So they use what's readily available. And it's warm. I mean, how else are you going to get something warm when you're in the far north of Canada or Alaska or Greenland, which would be some of the areas in which some of these traditional kinds of Eskimo ethnography would be more applicable than, say, other kinds of Eskimos in other areas of northern North America. So in that context, again, contextualizing it, seeing the environmental reasons for it, seeing what the alternatives or lack of alternatives were, it no longer becomes the extreme statement about cultural practices among the Eskimo and how revolting they are. Rather, you see it as kind of a natural outcome of the technology and the environment and values, and all the kinds of values play in here about males and females, how one presents oneself in terms of the body, what one has available, what one considers to be important, what one considers to be expendable or alternative kind of experience. I think it becomes less extreme. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just be interested to know how they go about storing the urine. I mean,
they wouldn't have to. It's readily available every day. I mean, it's not a thing where, gee, 5 days from today I have a date with gentleman caller number 5 behind the blue door. It's, for days and days and days. I haven't seen any other human being except family members in my own immediate nuclear family. And way off on the horizon, I spy another Eskimo. And boy, both that Eskimo and this family, zoom! Because whatever, Eskimos are just like us in this sense. They're universal human needs and emotional needs. They're fulfilled by all cultures. And in this sense, even though the pragmatic circumstances of everyday life among the Eskimo require them to be somewhat or semi-isolated. When there is an occasion for these family units to exchange or be around or associate or have some kind of human interaction with another Eskimo or another Eskimo family, you can bet they're on the scene right now. So, you know, Erninek, or say Asiak, who would be the wife in this case, really there was such an occurrence in that novel, Top of the World, in which these two play the lead roles. This is a role that in the movie was played by Peter, the British actor, Peter O'Toole, thank you. It was his first role, not starring. It was kind of a minor role, and he played you have to know who he was to know he was in the movie. It's kind of like knowing James Arness. Later, Matt Dillon was first a carrot in some science fiction movie that was out. That, you know, for those of you who know science fiction movies, you know which movie. It's called The Thing, I think, or some such thing. One of those wonderful byproducts or cultural products of the 50s that I just adored. Anyway, Peter O'Toole is playing a Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and he's, you know, trekking through this area where Erninek and Asiak happen to be. He spies them, they spy him. No, that's not, I've got it wrong. I'm sorry, I can move back. Back up. Here's Asiak and Erninek. They're in their area of the world. And a missionary working among the Eskimo. That's right. A missionary working among the Eskimo, or trying to work among the Eskimo, spies them on yonder horizon, just like, and they don't know who he is. They just see there's a human over there, and they're over here, and the important thing to do then is to come together, right, and have some good hoedown, or whatever Eskimo's version of that might be. And part of it many times would include exchange of wives, exchange of anything, and anyone, except children, of course, in this case. And the missionary really wasn't expecting that wholesale reception and that wonderful warmth he was about to receive, because even though Asiak's, I sometimes get the gender confused. That's a condition in my life, not in this lecture. Anyway, she has prepared her hair. She has, but not prepared her body. So imagine that you're the missionary. You're by yourself, and suddenly you're in the warmth of this Eskimo family, and Ernenek's suggesting to you, because they don't really speak to one another, because the missionary hasn't ever bothered to learn Inuit. He hasn't bothered to learn, because his point is to bring people to Jesus, not to bring himself to a greater familiarity with Eskimo customs, values, language, culture, etc., which would, of course, be a high value among anthropologists. So, a lack of communication ensues, and misunderstanding ensues, and whatever else is going on, Erninek knows that in order to demonstrate his one-upness, in order to demonstrate that he is superior to this stranger with this unruly red hair, that for some reason Hans Royce depicted the missionaries having red hair, right? I think that was to just show a startling, it was a red thatch. It was really strikingly red. And of course Eskimos would never have seen red hair, or any other color hair other than really black, and really dark black at that, because there's not much variation among Eskimos in that area, especially in this isolated northern populations. So suddenly the missionary, the red-haired missionary, finds himself, you know, sometimes cultural communication, you don't really need to talk anymore. The woman is being offered, you know what the offer is, you know what you're supposed to be doing, and you're saying, no, 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 I don't want to do that, right? Well, that is a supreme insult to Eskimos. Not only does the wife feel stripped of all worth, so to speak, among other things, but the male, her husband, in this case Erninek, it's the height of insult. It's the worst thing one Eskimo male can do to another. If you have joined an Eskimo family in their home, and you're a single male Eskimo, and you refuse his offer of his wife when she's ready, or she's willing, then you have done the supreme insult that you can do to another Eskimo. So, in an emotional rage, Ernenek pushes the missionary to show his disapproval or his whatever, and the missionary falls, hits his head on a jagged piece of ice that's sticking out from the wall, and dies right there. Well, Ernenek and Asiak aren't particularly upset. You know, we come, we go. They really had a curiosity about where that red head came from, but other than that, you know, hail fellow, well met. Sorry about that. See you later. You'll come back again. So they take off. And then in the ensuing chapters, you know, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police find this gentleman, this missionary, because he's been reported as missing, etc. And so, you know, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they get their man, whatever else they do, and they go after their man, which turns out to be our hero, Ernenek. Of course, Ernenek doesn't understand that he's done anything wrong. This would be, you know, Canadian courts intervening or being intrusive into Eskimo culture. A cultural misunderstanding, cultural non-sharing. No, one person is talking this way, the other person is talking that way, but there's no exchange of communication. So even later on, when Peter O'Toole, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, playing a very minor role, comes up and catches these Eskimos, this couple and the child, and I think by this time they've had a daughter. You know, they don't understand why this guy, quote, is apprehending them. They don't even have a concept of apprehension, let alone why this person wants to, you want to do what with me where? You want to put me behind what? You know, bars, etc. And, you know, very quickly the ineptness of a Canadian, forgive me, Canadians. I always think when I look at this little monitor right here, I'm looking at the camera. There's the camera, so forgive me, Canadians. But you're kind of made fun of here, and not by us, but by Hans Reusch, who was, I believe, Danish. And, you know, the thing is that Ernenek knows, or picks up right away, this guy, this Canadian Mounted Police, is not really very knowledgeable of the environment or of how to survive in the environment. In fact, he's trying to befriend this guy. The guy who would imprison him, he's trying to become a good Eskimo host to. And, you know, eventually tonight, I'll offer him Asiak. You know, then it'll just be a wonderful evening had by all. But during the day, you know, I'm taking with me hunting, and we're going. Of course, we're not talking to one another because, again, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police doesn't speak Inuit, and Ernenek doesn't speak English or French, whichever. In this case, it was English. And what happens? Well, a lot of things happened that day that mostly showed the Canadian up, meaning since it exposed his lack of knowledge about the environment and what it takes to survive. For example, at some point he sticks his hand in the water and then pulls his hand out of the water. And Ernenek just kind of looked at him quizzically and wondered why in the world he would do such a stupid thing. And then the Royal Canadian Mounted Police knows why, because his hand is freezing as it's on his body because he had stuck it in the water and then pulled it out. I mean, I don't know if he was supposed to keep his hand in the water or not, if that would have improved the situation any. But again, it was just to show you in that environment, we do what we normally think is okay to do. I don't remember why he was sticking his hand in the water, but you know, it was ultimately that was a very irrational decision. Even if the Canadian Mounted Policeman had really thought it through, he would also realize that. So anyway, Ernenek's response was to try to help the fellow, even though he had made a stupid, in Ernenek's mind, and in ours in reading the novel, a mistake, a stupid infraction of what it really takes to survive in that area. And but there wasn't really much he could do, and now the Eskimo, or rather the mounted policeman, is going to be in pain all this time. And then he does some other things that causes his own death. So the first Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman doesn't last very long, but others follow because that's what the Royal Canadian Mounted Policemen are about. And then at the end of the novel, you're in a court trial, and you're in a Canadian court, and the bewildered Eskimo are looking around wondering what in the world is going on. It's awfully hot in this room. And they start shedding their clothes, which of course is a no-no. But if you've lived in an environment in which 40 below is hot, imagine what it must be like in a heated courtroom in Canada. Even though you might find it drafty, cold, and etc., it would certainly be really uncomfortable for an Eskimo. In fact, Eskimo males were often seen, dog sledding by Anglos and others without their shirts on when it got, hot, like 20 below instead of 40 below or whatever it was. That was just, like I do sometimes here when I say it's humid and hot, until I get to another area of the world which is much hotter. I don't know if it could be any more humid than it gets in Houston. And I love Houston, so that's no problem there. So don't call me, don't write me, and don't email me about your love of Houston and my unappreciation of it. Okay, so that's pretty much my accounting of Eskimo anthropology. I have one left to do, which again is the eating of rotten bone marrow with maggots. And I choose that particular item because of their cuisine. I don't know if there's any Eskimo restaurants around. Because it's the most extreme, it's most revulsive to us. And yet, it's a good source of protein. Maggots are. That, in a diet that might otherwise, on occasion, be scarce of protein, it's a source of protein. So it would afford these people an ability to live. But we're talking about maggots. Everybody knows what a maggot is, right? It's a baby fly. It hasn't yet become a fly. It's just a kind of little white. Well, if you want to know what they look like, leave your wet cat food out on the back porch in the heat of the summer, and you'll quickly discover what's going to become a fly. Because the eggs are laid in the cat. This happened to me. That's obviously why I know this. And I left it out too long, and suddenly there were these white things in there moving around. And I realized they were maggots. They would become flies, except I flushed it down the toilet stool, and they didn't get their little wings to hum yet. And the bone marrow, of course, is another excellent source of nutrition, given a lack of alternatives at particular times. And this was not something they ate every day. I mean, I even gave you that cultural notion that, this was a special occasion. This was really pulling out the big guns. You've invited your boss to dinner, or you've invited a potential mate to dinner, and you want to really put on the big show here. And so one of the things Eskimos would indicate as the big show for dinner would be rotten bone marrow with maggots. Now, why rotten? Well, what is rotten? Rotten is kind of decomposition. What's decomposition? It means the structure of that product, in this case bone marrow, but they also had rotten other things they ate. And it was to make it more digestible. That's what it did. Your body could process it more readily. When you go to a restaurant here in Houston, and I won't name one because I might get a letter or an email from them or a really irate phone call. But there are certain restaurants in town that are really well known for their fine steaks, fine beef. I'm not a particular person who says, you shouldn't eat beef or anything like that. I'm just saying there's some restaurants known for that. And one of the things, if it's really a fine restaurant engaging in the sale of beef cooked near your table, we always say, or they like to say, this is the finest aged beef from Kansas or some such place, or Argentina, another restaurant I'm thinking of. What does that mean? Well, that means it's rotting. It's not to the point where you smell it yet. Sometimes if you go to the supermarket and you see the hamburger there and you turn it over and it's really a different color underneath than it was on top. Have you ever done that? You ever gotten home and said, my God, my heavens, this hamburger's varied in its color. Well, that's because they've colored it with something on the top, and underneath its natural process is occurring. And aged beef means rotting beef. And rotting beef doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does. It does mean decomposing, but again, it's not to the point where there's an odor. It's not to the point even sometimes where you have any response to it, biologically speaking. But it is to the point where the meat is decomposing. Its structure's breaking down. It's rotting. And that's what we mean by aged beef. If you put that, what's that food additive? What's it called? Tenderizer. I can't remember a brand name, would make it immediately. Adolph's Meat Tenderizer. Fine product on your tough round steak that didn't turn out to be as tender as you like. So as a capable housewife in our society, you just saturate it then with Adolph's Meat Tenderizer, and by the time hubby and the kids eat it, hey, it's great stuff. Right? That's because the tenderizer also encourages or hastens that destruction of the structure of the meat as a biological tissue, so that it becomes much more immediately digestible. All right, today's lecture has been primarily about an extension of talking more about Eskimo ethnography as portrayed in the culturally relative or moral relativity kind of context or way of presenting it. This will now lead us next time into a discussion of some of the writings and comments made by Ruth Benedict. We will try also to get this handout on the website, even today, if not before next Thursday, and so that you will be able to retrieve it yourself, because I will be going over it in some detail, but it will continue this concern with cultural relativism. And with that, I'll send you off into the day. Have a